Hello and welcome to One Move TV. I'm Julie Madison. Today I'm in Stockport in Cheshire to find out why a company specialising in property investment advice is advising its clients to invest in student property. That's buying property to rent to students. Traditionally, the student market has had a negative image, with problems arising over rent collection and general upkeep of properties by their tenants. But apparently this has all changed. I'm with Stuart Law of Assets. Stuart has some very interesting thoughts on the subject. Stuart, let's start off by you telling us a bit about Assets.
Assets is a group of property investment advisory companies operating UK and internationally. And the UK division has been established for about 10 years and looks at alternative residential assets that can maybe produce better returns for investors than standard product they could source themselves.
Tell us about the research that's been conducted by Savills.
Every couple of years, Savills analyse the student accommodation market. Student accommodation, if you look backwards over the last few years, has been a niche market. Some switched-on landlords have been very heavily involved in it, but many other people have always thought of the young ones, the old TV programme, and thought that's a place I don't want to be in property investment. But the market's moved on, and the Savills research clearly shows that the student marketplace for property investment across all aspects of that sector is extremely buoyant.
Stuart, on the back of this report then and what we've just discussed, what is the advice that you're giving from Assets to your clients?
We're very much focused on, first of all, student investment property should be part of your portfolio. That's a given. And then you need to make a decision which aspect or both aspects do you look at. You can't buy into a university hall. So that means you're either buying into a private hall of residence and buying what's known as a cluster apartment, say a 5-bedroom apartment with shared facilities for 5 students within an apartment block on a managed site with laundrette and so on, a gated complex for security. Or do they buy into traditional housing? So traditional, typically Victorian housing converted for student usage, and nowadays having to comply with HMO legislation. Housing in multiple occupancy legislation that protects the tenants in terms of the quality and health and safety of that housing stock and the way the landlord operates.
Okay. So how time sensitive is your advice then? Is this something, you know?
It's the only way our advice is time sensitive is that the student population is government driven. Government policy is driving the growth in the student population in the UK here. Both from our own people and from students from overseas. So our only time-dependent comment would be aware that this is a long-term growth cycle in student numbers. There are factors at play that are pressing downwards on the availability of housing stock. HMO licensing standards is reducing the number of Victorian houses, for example, in the housing stock for students.
Stuart, what would be your overall advice to people out there looking to make an investment in buy-to-let?
Well, you've got the buy-to-let market, and of course it breaks into many segments. The interesting thing about the student property market is that you tend to get premium rents. Might sound odd. Well, why would students pay more than traditional buy-to-let tenants? But it is true, they do. A student would rather pay £450, say, for a dedicated 1-bedroom flat in a private hall of residence for students than go 300 yards down the road and rent it for £375 and not be surrounded by students. The overseas students and the segments of students we're talking about can afford to do that.
What do Mum and Dad think of that, though?
They prefer it. They like the idea. There's a whole very large segment of students who go into the private halls who like the idea their children are going into a gated complex with laundrette, concierge, if not 24 hours, at least access to that 24-hour service plus people there all day. And it's gated, it's secure access. They like that idea. But at the same time, the housing. They don't want their children to be in that low quality of housing that they look back at and think, how did I live with that mould in the fridge, the kitchen that was falling apart? They don't want their children to have that, and they can afford to make sure they don't. It's interesting. The market's moved on.
So what does a student house look like? How much does it cost? And what's your return on investment? We're off to the university town of Manchester to find out.
You've got a situation where yields on student accommodation are typically well over 6% to as much as 8% at today's prices. And admittedly, you can do some deals, which is what we're doing. We're negotiating on behalf of our clients. And on the deal price we're achieving, even after refurbishment and tidying up costs to maximise rents, we're getting up to around 8% yield or so. So here's a typical bedroom in one of these Manchester Victorian houses. We've got in the corner a sink unit, a typical example of one of the small items that you've got to be aware of with the HMO licensing. Most cities and councils require there to be a sink unit inside the bedroom, for example, or a full ensuite bathroom, which isn't common, but some bedrooms in many houses do have ensuite nowadays. So that's a typical requirement, and yet many councils are also looking at removing that requirement in the next year or so.
So it's a bit confusing, isn't it?
It can be very confusing, and you might even find a legal requirement to have a sink this year, but it won't be there next year. Maybe they won't enforce you having to fit it this year because they're going to withdraw the requirement next year. So a lot of nitty-gritty detail in HMO licensing that can catch you out. That's where our HMO licensing certification comes in, which is part of our service.
So it's not what you'd expect really in a student property, is it? I mean, look at the shower. Newly fitted. Obviously, many of the properties that we acquire have bathrooms in a lot worse state than this to start with, and this would be the end result for one of the bathrooms. And again, another HMO point: how many bathrooms do you need in a property against the number of bedrooms, the number of people living in the property? And the combination of shared bathrooms, shower rooms and ensuite rooms, there's always a calculation in the HMO licensing to have the correct number of those facilities for the number of people living in the house. So in this house, which has, 7 bedrooms, you have sinks in each bedroom.
That's right,
yes. Shower room.
Yeah, shower rooms, bathrooms in the right combination for the right number of bedrooms. And so we've got a bathroom here, we've got another bathroom elsewhere in the house, and we've got the individual sinks in each of the rooms. Right, so here we've got a typical refurbished kitchen, in fact from a couple of years ago, and out the window we can see garden space, off-road parking, not particularly of great use to students, but what we have got is an example of an exit route for an investor who's acquiring a student house, but in a leafy suburb, and good high ceilings, a nice family home in fact, and with the garden space and parking area, easy to see how this could be transformed back to a family home if ever wanted to be in the future.
So if you or someone you know is looking for a buy-to-let property investment, then perhaps adding a student property to your portfolio just might be a lucrative move.